Did you ever wonder what could have been with the AWA had things gone differently? Had their fortunes gone differently? Had certain wrestlers not left and perhaps more money would have been at the disposal of the Gagnes? Well, wonder no further. You can go to Brad Drake's YouTube channel and experience the 1987 Supermod for yourself, as Brad Drake starts off in May 1987 along with Greg Gagne, Baron von Raschke, Vern Gagne himself, Nick Bockwinkel, Larry Zbyszko, Kurt Hennig, and a slew of others as he plays and saves the AWA.
Hey everyone, this is Brian Ferguson, the host of Bumps and Thumps, the Talk of Wrestling. We are on today because of you. And in order to continue the podcast and get the guests on here that require some financial compensation, we're going to need help from people like you. Right now, we're attempting to get our YouTube videos monetized through YouTube. We need 1,000 subscribers in order to do that. So I've decided that if the 1,000 subscriber will get a free t-shirt like this from me and come on the show as a guest on the podcast. So subscribe today, and that 1,000 subscriber will be contacted by me and be given a t-shirt and come on the show. So subscribe today. If you already have, thank you. If you haven't, please do, and tell your friends and subscribe today. And we'll talk to you soon, and enjoy the podcast. Welcome to another edition of Bumps and Thumps, the Talk of Wrestling. I'm Brian Ferguson. My guest today is a returning guest, one of my favorite guys in the world, AWA historian, wrestling historian, legend in the AWA and historian world. Welcome back, Mr. George Schire. George, thanks for coming back on, my friend. Good to see you.
It's always good to be on your show, Brian. You know, we talk about me coming on time again, and I like it. So I love talking old wrestling.
I do too, you know, and so I love having you on because, you know, you're a straight shooter. You don't, if something's wrong or if I don't know it and I say something wrong, you're there to say, that's not how it really went down. This is how it went down. So today, though, we're going to have a special treat, I guess I want to say, for everybody. We're going to talk about tag team wrestling. And I talked to George. I reached out to him about it. And first, I wanted to get your take on how did tag team wrestling really come about in our business? How did it kind of, you know, single, we talk about Hans Schmidt, Frank Gotch, all these legends, but the tag teams seem to kind of get put to the side. So how did tag team wrestling really come about?
Well, now you've just opened the door for me to give the cheap plug.
The book
for Minnesota's Golden Age of Wrestling, available on Amazon.
All right.
To answer your question, that was impromptu, by the way. I just happened to have the book sitting here. Honest. Tag teams, as it is, as I stated in my book, tag team wrestling actually started around as early as the 1930s.
Okay. And
they were out in the Pacific Northwest territory. And really the concept was, you know, promoters kind of figured out that if we have two guys that can go at it in hell-bent on destroying one another in a grudge program together, and we can draw money with it, well, if we put each guy with a partner and create this storyline and create this hatred and this rivalry and this competition towards a championship, we can, you know, double the pleasure, double the fun.
Yeah.
And so that's really where it started. It was kind of by accident. I will tell you that the original concept of a tag team match, and this is where the word comes in, tag. Originally, they had to tag one another in and out of the ring, the two partners. And the referee would have to enforce those rules that wrestler outside the ring can't come in until his partner tags him and he gets to come in. Right. Well, then the fun could start because the one good guy tagged off and the referee didn't see it. So the partner's coming in. So the referee's trying to get him out. And then the bad guys are double teaming the good guy in the ring and they're getting away with stuff. I mean, it was all about the psychology.
Yeah.
The other thing about the original tag team concept, which got lost through the years, was there was a rope that was on the corner of the turnbuckle.
Yes.
Draped over, maybe this long. And the guy outside the ring had to hold on to that tag rope, hang on to it through the course of the match. That was the idea. And he couldn't come in and he couldn't let go of that rope until he was tagged in properly. And it worked both ways for the heels and the villains. But usually the heels ended up being the ones that the referee didn't see the tag. And, the fans are yelling and booing the poor referee and the psychology of it.
Yeah.
And the other thing that was important about the early tag teams is just like singles wrestling, you had to give the fans a reason to want to see these two teams do battle.
Yeah.
So the ideas over the course of the decades were, the list was endless. You had guys that claimed to be brothers. You had guys that were of ethnic origins. And so that's really where it all started. It kind of evolved over the decades after World War II.
Yeah.
And so you're getting into the very late 40s and then into the 50s. Tag team wrestling just took off in all territories around the country.
Yeah, it's interesting that it started actually in the 30s, as you said, and I've watched some older matches from the late 50s on the archives. It's on a YouTube channel with the Kowalskis brothers, Hans Schmidt, Wilbur Schneider, all those guys. It's interesting. I mean, you watch them, you talk about that rope, it's there, they're holding, the good guys for the most part are holding it. And it is. So want to bring up some pictures if you don't mind, and we could kind of go through that a little bit, if you're ready for that.
Right. I actually, I sent you a few pictures.
You did, and I'm going to bring them up right now.
Which may play into some of the things that we can talk about today.
So let's talk about the wall here, this wall of fame here, the Wrestle Wall.
Well, I only thought that was appropriate because we are going to talk about tag teams. And this is a wall that it's actually an old picture. I think this picture is about 10 years old now.
Okay.
But it's in my wrestling room and it featured tag teams. And as you look across the four or the three rows that you can see clearly, there are some very diverse, very interesting combinations. We got the Torres brothers and the Lasowski brothers, and we've got Brute Bernard and Skull Murphy on there, and Mad Dog Vachon and Baron von Raschke, and we got the Anderson brothers. And I mean, if you kind of get the theme, it was all about being a brother or being a hated heel and or maybe an ethnic hero. And as I mentioned to you a minute ago, when you look at the late 40s, then into the 50s, with World War II ending.
Yes.
And Brian, I'm going to take you back to, I think, one of the earlier shows that I was on with you. You asked me how I got involved in wrestling. And I will always tell the story that it was in 1959, September, when I was watching television and I saw wrestling on TV. But I also told you that my very first match that I ever attended was when I was 6 years old, and I went with my dad.
Yes.
And, at 6 years old, here you go. This was the card, the actual program.
Yes.
And it says, Revenging Russians versus Japanese. And it was Mitsu Arakawa, Kinji Shibuya, against Ivan and Karol Kelmakov. And at 6 years old, I learned a very valuable lesson, though I didn't realize it till a few years later. But these two teams were playing on fan emotion. And World War II had ended just about a decade earlier. We still, in our minds in America, we still didn't like the Japanese because they were the cause of the war. The Russians, they were still evil, and they put them together in this match, two heels. And that was unique, of course, having two heel teams go at it. But here's where I learned the psychology, because you had two heel teams, and generally speaking, fans would be forced to pick a favorite in a heel versus heel match. But in this case, I think I remember telling you that when one of the Japanese guys would hit a Russian, the fans would cheer. And when one of the Russians would hit one of the Japanese, the fans would cheer. They didn't like either team.
Yeah.
Literally did not like either team. And it was kind of I think the fans were sitting there just hoping that the four of them just eliminate each other.
Yeah.
And so that was an early lesson. But I will tell you that the Russians, Ivan and Karol Kelmakov, they were kind of the start of the brother tag team. They weren't real brothers,
right?
And they weren't real Russians.
Yeah.
Two guys come together and claim to be Russians, and they had the longevity to go an entire decade together as a team, and with various offshoots. They also, between the two of them, Ivan and Karol, they also had a couple of other brothers that they put into the mix over the 10 years. But till 1963, they wrestled in virtually every territory that was in existence in the 50s and the very early 60s.
Yeah. Wow.
So that tells you their drawing power.
Yeah.
And longevity was important in those days.
Yeah.
The same could also be said for Mitsu and Kinji, because they off and on teamed together and with various partners also carried on the "we hate the Japanese" agenda of the 50s and 60s.
Yeah.
And there you go. That's how it kind of started for me in the Twin Cities.
Yeah. This one here, the next one we're talking about, the Wying Tag Team Champions, Tiny Mills and Stan Kowalski. Weren't they, if I remember correctly, weren't they the first AWA World Tag Team Champions?
They were. Good memory.
Murder Incorporated.
Yes. And the reason I gave you this particular program page is because Stan and Tiny came back to Minnesota, which again was the headquarters of the then NWA. And then in 1960, when it became AWA, Minneapolis, Minnesota was the territory or the headquarters. So what this program tells you is that when Tiny and Stan came back to Minneapolis, they were revered as being not only international tag team champions, which they were billed at upon arrival, but they had actually toured together in 58 and 59 as a team in Australia, Japan, and in various other cities and territories around the country. So when they came back to Minneapolis, they were well known. And even though in the kayfabe era, a lot of fans wouldn't have heard of them, although they knew of Tiny and they knew of Stan here in the AWA territory, because Tiny had been a mainstay here in the 50s as one of our top heels.
Yeah.
And then, of course, Stan, he was 10 years younger, give or take a year. He was 10 years younger, and he started here in Minneapolis.
Okay.
So they came back recognized as international champions based on, and they were true in the programs on the TV. They said they've traveled all over the world and they're here to display their dominance to AWA fans. Wow. And when Vern started the AWA, Tiny and Stan were immediately changed from NWA champions to AWA champions. And the rest was history. Yeah. I will point out, when they were NWA, we will always clarify that the NWA never officially recognized any team as world champions, but various territories had NWA champions all the time through the 50s and 60s.
Yes, I
And
remember. We
that
talked
was a
about that.
promotional,
Yep.
it was a promotional tag team title.
Yep, I remember we talked about that a few sessions back about tag team titles not recognized as world titles except in that territory. So yeah, interesting.
So when I'm watching in 1959 in September, which right now we are in the month of September, and so
Yes.
we're going back, 62 years. And I turned on the TV that particular night, and I saw Tiny and Stan on TV. And for whatever reason, in my 8-year-old mind, I liked the heels. I liked what they were doing on TV, and they became my favorite tag team at that moment.
Oh, wow.
And, then of course I was fortunate to get to know Stan personally over the years, and that was always a blessing because he was just a great friend. So
yeah,
that's how it started officially 62 years ago when I started following it regularly.
All right. Here we go. There's the Graham brothers.
Eddie and Jerry. That wrestling review cover, and that is from my collection. That was the one that I had mentioned in previous episodes that I had the honor of walking with my grandma to the drugstore, and on the newsstand was this first issue, which I didn't realize any relevance of it at that point.
Yeah.
It didn't mean anything that it was a premiere issue or anything like that. But she gave me the 50 cents, which I remember her telling me 50 cents, that's a lot of money. But bless her heart, she gave it to me, and I have that magazine. The Graham brothers, they were probably at that time, and to be on the cover of the premiere issue of Wrestling Review, they were probably the premier tag team of the time. They were big in New York, which at the time was Capital Sports. It wasn't, this is pre-WWF, all that stuff.
Okay.
And they were huge as a blonde heel brother tag team. Surprise, surprise, they were not real brothers either. Jerry Graham was the only real Graham out of the bunch. Eddie was Eddie Gossett. And but together they became very well known, and just the idea of a brother tag team. And I would point out that brother tag teams were probably dominant for the 50s, because we had the Brunetti brothers, we had the Scott brothers, we had the Rougeaus, the original Rougeaus, not the kids that later on went in the WWF.
Right.
The originals. We had the Bravo brothers, we had the Kelmikoff brothers, we had the Lasowskis, the Nielsen's, the Volkoffs, the Von Brauners, and I mean, we could go on and on.
Yeah.
Brothers. And 90% of them were not real brothers.
Well, it's sold.
So the Graham brothers were huge, and probably, again, on magazine covers that were published out of New York, logically, it made sense that, most of the guys that would appear on their covers or inside the magazines would be East Coast wrestlers because they were published out there.
Yeah.
The Grahams had a tremendous feud, and to me, it was one of the most interesting stories for tag teams. They had a feud with, and I didn't mention this team yet, but they had a feud with the Bastien brothers. And I think I gave you a picture of the Bastiens if you want to bring them up.
There they are.
Now this is it's not the greatest picture in the world, but the reason I shared it with you is because each of them have their arms on a chest.
Yes.
And that little chest was what each of the Bastiens, that's Red Bastien on the right.
Okay.
And that's Lou Bastien, his brother, on the left. Lou Bastien was really Lou Klein, great Detroit-born wrestler and a really good worker in his own right. Together, they became the Bastiens. Well, they had this hot feud with Eddie and Jerry Graham.
Okay.
And this feud went on for over a year, literally selling out arenas on the East Coast. When the feud was kind of dying down, they had to come up with something different. Now, let me back up just a speck and tell you that the Bastiens had a gimmick.
Okay.
Their gimmick was that they wanted to be champions, and that each match that they won, they would bring this small chest to the ring, set it on the apron, And after the match that they would win, they would each drop a silver dollar into this chest,
Okay.
with the idea being that the chest was full of silver dollars because over the time they'd been wrestling together and their success, they'd won all their matches, that this chest was filled with silver dollars, and this was their gimmick. So just as their battles with the Grahams are kind of coming to a close, they got to come up with something different to prolong the program. The Graham brothers got a hold of that chest during the course of one of their matches on the ring apron. And believe it or not, those dastardly Grahams decided they were going to dump that chest of silver dollars not only all over the ring, but the ring floor.
Oh.
And so there were silver dollars all over, and they were real. This was a real thing. And now, you know, the Bastines, they're not only embarrassed, they have to get revenge for the fact that all their silver dollars are gone. I would say that if there were any fans that walked away with a silver dollar or 2 or 3 that night from picking them up, and if they still have it, that's kind of a nice memento.
Yeah.
They were real silver dollars.
Wow.
And then the feud went on again for a long time between the Bastines and the Grahams.
Yeah.
So when I talk about the program and the longevity of something and how they can keep the storyline going, this was one of, in my opinion, one of the most fun to look back on.
Yeah.
And if you get any of those early issues of Wrestling Review, they do talk about in the early Graham issue, the premiere issue, and they also talk about it a couple issues later when the Bastines were on the cover of Wrestling Review, and about their, it was 2 or 3 issues later, of which I also have, I have that magazine.
No way, I don't believe it.
And I wouldn't give it up. Don't ask. So that was how they prolonged that.
All right, here we go. The Assassins.
Oh boy. Now you're getting into something that, you know, we talked on a previous program about the lost art of the masked wrestler. Yes. And how important it was to have that hidden identity and come from parts unknown, and the promoters don't know who he is and the fellow wrestlers don't know who he is. And why is he wearing a mask? Is it because he's ugly, or is it because he's, you know, as he says, I had to put the mask on because if everybody knew who I was, they wouldn't sign to wrestle me, you know, so in order to get the big matches, I got to put this mask on. Yeah. Well, here we have the Assassins. Now, this is the version of the Assassins that is most famous throughout the late 50s into the 60s. And this is Jody Hamilton, who was the Jody Hamilton. He went by both names. He was the real life brother of Larry Rocky Hamilton, the Missouri Mauler. So anybody that, you know, didn't know that, there you go. But Joe Hamilton teamed up with a guy named Tom Renesto, and they put masks on. Originally, they were called the Bolos. The Great Bolo, it was Bolo and the Great Bolo. And they were masked, pretty much looked the same as they do here. But then in other territories, they became the Assassins. And the whole idea was the same concept. They wouldn't unmask unless they were beaten, 2 pinfalls, 2 submission falls. Of course, that was never going to happen.
Right.
The idea is for the good guys to try to get the masks off, and so the gimmick was the same, but who they were, and in the kayfabe era where that stuff just wasn't leaked out, like it, could be today.
Right.
And they just went, they were all over the country. I mean, they wrestled in the Mid-South, they wrestled in the South, they wrestled in the Carolinas, Florida, Texas. Renesto and Hamilton were the real deal.
Yeah.
But there were other heel teams because again, promoters found that they could have Assassins, they could have, I think I gave you the Mighty Yankees. I want you to throw them up.
There they are.
There they are. Entering the ring, getting introduced. They were the Mighty Yankees. And again, there were different versions in different territories of guys under the mask. This particular one, Mighty Yankee #1 on the left, Mighty Yankee on the right, #2. That's all they were, #1 and #2.
Yes.
#1 was Moose Evans. #2 was Bob Stanley. He also wrestled as Bob Merrill and some other names too, but he was Bob Stanley. but they also wrestled without their masks in
Yeah.
some of the territories.
Right
And
here.
if you throw that next picture up, there
Yep.
they are.
Yep.
Moose Evans on the left, Bob Stanley on the right. And they, in this picture, they wrestled as brothers, Moose and Giant. Moose Evans, Giant Evans. You gotta love it.
Yeah.
But you know, if you look at them, they kind of look alike.
Yeah, they
And then
do.
they put a mask on and work in another territory as the Yankees. So they were able to, really tell the story for tag team wrestling.
Wow. Those are some big guys, even looking at them.
Well, Moose Evans, I never saw Gene, or I never saw Bob Merrill personally in live action. But Moose Evans on the left, he was always billed at about 6'8", and he was probably a legit 6'4" or 5". He was a big dude.
Yeah.
And usually around the 300-pound mark. When he wrestled as Moose Evans, he would wrestle with cut off jeans, more of a lumberjack type wrestler.
Okay, yeah.
But of course, when he was Moose here, and then you saw him in that earlier picture when he was one of the Yankees with the mask. In those days, you'd never recognize him. I mean,
yeah.
And again, it was different territories. And so people didn't have the ability to know that, Moose Evans and Giant Evans weren't real brothers, if they heard about them at all, because without, the internet and the sources we have today, people didn't know about what happened in the next city.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, here we go. Some heel team here.
Well, this goes back to that World War II and the hatred of a foreigner. Boy, I tell you, on the left there, you got Baron von Raschke in his real heel days. And we all know that he was, plain old, simple, shy, kind, good-natured Jim Raschke from Nebraska, as he says.
Yeah.
But when he adopted that heel persona as a German and, come up with that accent, fake accent, and the belligerence that he offered in his interviews, he hooked up with one of the legendary German wrestlers, Hans Schmidt. Now, the interesting thing there is that Hans Schmidt himself was not a real German. He was actually a French Canadian. And he took on the Hans Schmidt persona as shaved his head and became a bald German, because again, it got over in the 50s and the 60s when America, when you went to wrestling matches, at least, America hated Germany. They hated the Germans, the evil Germans, because they were going to trounce our American wrestlers and they were going to take our titles and go back to the mother country, and all the rhetoric that they would use on their interviews. Yeah. And so they got over, huge. Here now, of course, we didn't have any brother connection or anything, but we know that Baron also formed a team with Mad Dog Vachon.
Yep.
We know that Hans Schmidt held great honor in a lot of tag teams. The hated German with another fellow hated German, Hans Hermann, who was a huge, and I mean that in both size and box office in the 50s. Hans Hermann was a good draw, and him and Schmidt together. And then Herman was with Killer Kowalski, Walter Kowalski, the original Killer Kowalski. Really? Yeah. Herman and Kowalski, very, very good team. So you throw various offshoots in there with these combinations, and they were always the bad guys and could draw the fans.
Here we go, the Anderson brothers. First.
Boy, I tell you what, now this probably talks about legacy better than anything that we could.
Yeah.
We've got two guys who, first of all, let's say it up front, they were the Minnesota Wrecking Crew, Lars on the left, Gene on the right, the Anderson brothers. Well, Gene was the only real Anderson. And Gene was a South St. Paul, Minnesota graduate of South St. Paul High School. He was a wrestler that got a lot of his early training from Vern Gagne in the late 50s, very early 1960, 61-ish. Gene was being trained by Vern. And for the next 4 years, from 61 to 65, Vern would usually pick a wrestler, usually one each year at that early point, where he'd train a wrestler. And Gene would assist with Vern behind the scenes and train the wrestler. So Gene knew the fundamentals. He knew how to work. He was likely, in his own way, a shooter.
Yeah.
I don't think you really wanted to mess with him. But in the AWA, he never really got over as anything more than a preliminary wrestler. A lot of times you would see him in the early 60s on TV, maybe doing a job for someone or teamed with someone, and then his partner on TV would take the pinfall. But Gene had that reputation from being a tough guy.
Yeah.
Well, in 1965, one of Vern's graduates, the guy he worked with, was Larry Hynemi, a St. Cloud College graduate, came to Vern for some training, and that's Lars Anderson. So after Gene worked with Lars, or Larry in this case, Hynemi, during the first year of Larry's debut in the AWA, they had a chance to work together in matches against each other. If you look at a lot of old AWA results, you'll see Gene Anderson against Larry Hynemi. Usually Hynemi was going over Gene because Vern was, grooming Larry for future matches.
Yeah.
Well, Gene got the idea that him and Larry were good friends. They enjoyed working together. So Gene got an offer to go down south, and he took Larry with him. And there was where the Anderson brothers were born. They first ventured into Tennessee very briefly as Lars and Gene, and then they went into the Carolinas and Atlanta. And Lars and Gene Anderson in 1967, 68 were the dominant heel team in that territory, the Carolinas, Atlanta, so forth. So anytime you saw a magazine article, some of the national magazines, the Andersons were featured, Lars and Gene. Now, AWA fans, they may have remembered Gene Anderson, but very few connected. I mean, obviously some knew, but very few connected that Lars was Larry Hynemi. Hynemi just disappeared. So this legacy went on for a couple of years. And in 1969, Larry Hynemi got the bug to come home, meaning Minneapolis territory.
Yeah.
And so he did. What had happened while he was gone for that couple of years with Gene, Vern had trained another wrestler. And remember, I told you he was kind of doing them one at a time at that point in time.
Yeah.
You have the big training camps he had later where he'd have a dozen guys try out, and then 6 of them would come out of the camp as stars.
Yeah.
So he trained a guy by the name of Alan Rogowski. And Al Rogowski made his wrestling debut as Rock Rogowski. In the initial Rock Rogowski matches after his training, he was touted as being possibly related to the Crusher and the Bruiser because of his appearance at the time. He had a blonde crew cut, kind of built along the lines of Bruiser and Crusher.
Yeah.
Then over the next year, he ended up where he was reported to be a nephew of Dick the Bruiser. Well, when Lars came back home, right before he left the Carolinas and Atlanta, Alan Rogowski went down south and joined Lars and Gene as Ole Anderson. There you go. And that was kind of an earlier picture of Ole Anderson. So Gene was now with his other brother, and Lars is back home teaming with Larry Hennig. And they had a 3-year run together.
Oh, yeah.
Yep, they did.
Yeah.
And then the new Minnesota Wrecking Crew then was Gene and Ole. Now, they are probably the most famous of the Anderson brothers, the most remembered, because they were together for, from about 1970, pretty much through the 70s, Gene and Ole were together. So they had a long run together. There were a couple of times when Lars would come back and join his brothers, just, one-off type things. There was also a time when Ole and Lars teamed very briefly together.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
then there was a time later on in the early 80s, I believe, uh, maybe it was the late 70s, but Lars and Ole actually feuded, had a
Oh,
brother
wow.
war, had a brother war where Lars was the good guy. And, brotherly love, but, we're going to take the other guy out. That always went over well at the box office. So, how can two brothers hate each other? I mean, it's good for the storyline.
Yeah.
But the Anderson brothers, in the form of Lars, Ole, and Gene, really had a long, good 10-year, 12-year run. I
Yeah.
will point out that both Lars and Gene were born in the same year. So they were the same age.
Oh, okay.
In any genealogy, unless you were twins, that would be hard to do.
Yeah.
But we never knew about that back then. So then, after Gene was retiring, because he'd been getting up there in the 50s, in
Yeah.
the age 50 range and stuff. Well, he started to take on a managerial role for a while with some teams, and Ole started branching off a little bit with other partners.
Mhm.
Well, then he comes up with a new partner. They're going to continue the Anderson legacy, and he comes up with his brother. At one time, it was his brother, so that
Yes.
would have been a younger brother of the three of them. There was another time when Ole was the uncle of Arn Anderson.
There he is, double A.
And there you go. You've got Arn Anderson and Ole Anderson. Now, the interesting thing about Arn is that he was also from Minnesota. His real name was Marty Lundy.
Yeah.
Well, it is Marty Lundy. He's still with us, thankfully.
Yeah.
And he was a Minnesota wrestler, but he never wrestled in Minnesota. He got his training wherever he had gotten it from, and he went on the road. And he had some great success, early success in various combinations and matches. But when he became Arn, and he actually wrestled early on as Marty Lundy, but when he became Arn Anderson, like I said, originally they were called brothers. Then the story changed. It was Ole uncle and Arn the nephew.
Yeah.
I think they were cousins. I think I've got some programs where they were cousins at one point.
Yeah.
It depends on how the promoter wanted to spin it.
Yeah.
And again, being kayfabe, we never heard about it.
Right.
So that's kind of how the Anderson legacy went on. I will point out, and as long as we're talking family legacy here,
Mhm.
there was a time when Ric Flair was also reported to be a cousin
Yeah.
to the
Yeah.
Anderson brothers. And I'm going to give you a really weird one now. And as I was talking here, this came to mind. It's weird when you look at, if you wanted to do the family tree, because if Gene and Lars were brothers and Ole became a brother, well, Ole was also reported to be a nephew to Dick the Bruiser. Dick the Bruiser was reported early or all through his career as being a cousin to the Crusher. The Crusher was reported to be a brother to Art Nielsen, Stan Nielsen. He wrestled with Art Nielsen, but Stan Nielsen, who was a brother to Art. Well, if you look at this family tree, wow. And the truth of the matter is none of it's real. So you got to love it.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. All right. Well, let's talk about these guys.
Well, I put this one up there because one of the things that I had mentioned early on is that what really made a good tag team in the day is longevity and the ability to get over, maybe in one territory for a long period of time, and even better if you could get over in multiple territories.
Yeah.
My late friend Jim Melby and I, we used to talk about tag teams and having the longevity together. Well, Red Bastien told me, he said that he referred to it as an established tag team. That was Red Bastien's comment. An established team, as Red referred to it, was a team that could wrestle in multiple territories, therefore being established. They weren't just a one town or a one city, one promotion team. And Red could use that example in the sense of him being with Lou Bastien or Lou Klein,
Okay.
which I'm going to touch on. The Bastine brothers, I got to backtrack here. The
Okay.
Bastine brothers, Red and Lou, they were Red and Lou Bastine every territory they wrestled in, except when they went into Detroit, they were, you ready for this?
Ready.
They were the Klein brothers, Lou and Red Klein, only in Detroit.
Right.
And the reason for that was, and I've got programs to verify this, the only reason they were the Klein brothers was because, as I mentioned to you, Lou Klein was a Detroit-born wrestler. He was a hometown hero. So naturally, he's going to stay Lou Klein, and he brought in his brother Red. Isn't that amazing? And that's an obscure fact. So they were the Klein brothers. But anyway, Red Bastine said an established team had to work multiple territories, which the Bastines did. And then Red also wrestled with Billy Red Lyons. They were in the AWA together, and they also wrestled in Texas together. So Red said that made us an established team. That was his version of it. But in the case of these two guys, Rip Hawk on the left in the front, and Swede Hansen in the back. Swede was a little bigger. Rip Hawk was a great journeyman wrestler over the years. Main evented a lot as a single. Very reliable hand in the ring, very respected. He had some tag teams with other guys, Rock Hunter being one of them. But when he hooked up with Swede Hansen, Swede was a guy who on his own, he never really cut it. He was kind of middle of the card, but together they were dynamite. It was like, this was magic, and they could draw the fans. And they went into Texas, they went into the Carolinas, they were in Atlanta together, and just always, if not the main event, the semifinal, and always just a top-notch team, and always given a push. You see they have a title belt on there.
Yeah,
I'm not sure which title belt that is. I can't read it. I've got different pictures of them with different belts.
Yeah.
And I'm going to admit something here, gang. I'm not really a belt guy where I can get in and say, okay, which titles they had.
Yeah.
But this one here, they were champions of one of the organizations they were with.
Wow.
They had the longevity. They wrestled pretty much together for a lot of the 60s, most of the 60s.
Yeah.
And I used to get programs from Gene Gordon in the Carolinas. He'd send me the programs, and I always got excited when I saw Hawk and Hansen on there. Yeah. I saw Rip Hawk in St. Louis wrestle a singles match, and in his own way, I was always impressed with him. So this was one of those teams that they were a great team.
Yeah, yeah. All right, and our last pick.
Well, this is a weird one. I think it's fairly common today in today's wrestling, where I think we can agree that tag team wrestling is not utilized as it used to be. Not to say there isn't tag team wrestling, but certainly the storylines and the angles and the breakups and the strange partnerships and different things, I don't think they have today. This was a weird one. And it is the only time that we had 8 brawlers. All 4 of them were heels. And this was from the St. Paul Auditorium in April of '71. We had Larry Hennig, Nick Bockwinkel, Lars Anderson, and Blackjack Lanza on one side.
Okay.
Against Mad Dog and Butcher Vachon and Stan Crusher Kowalski, who was the manager of Shozo Strong Kobayashi. And they were going to battle each other basically for local supremacy, which 4 heels were the best.
Oh, wow.
And it was interesting. It was interesting how they wrote this thing up and played it out on TV, because it was written out that the Vachons and Kobayashi had the advantage because Stan was the manager of Kobayashi and could offer guidance in the match, and also had his own tag team success with Tiny Mills through the years.
Right.
So they made that known. But on the other side, the storyline went that Lars and Larry, being a dominant team at that point in time, teamed up with the young, snobbish, arrogant Nick Bockwinkel. And then they were joined by Jack Lanza, who at the time was managed by Bobby Heenan. So you didn't really have anybody other than Hennig and Lars that were the team there, but Lanza and Bockwinkel coming in, but Lanza was managed by Heenan. So it was ended up where it was declared it was going to almost be 5 against 4 because Heenan was the mystery part of it.
Yeah, Heenan, Bobby.
Now, remember I talked earlier when I saw the Russians against the Japanese.
Yes.
Where in that scenario, the fans would not choose because they were both foreigners and they hated both of them and they just wanted them both to be gone from America.
Yeah.
Well, in this particular situation, other than Kobayashi, and by 1971, that Japanese, the Japanese hatred or promotion towards being hated wasn't as predominant, shall we say.
Yeah.
So even though he was from Japan and he was a heel, he wasn't presented in the same scenario as his predecessors like Mitsu and Kinji and Dr. Moto and Mr. Moto and so on.
Yeah.
So we had the fans in this one, though you have 4 heels on each team, the fans did take a side.
Okay.
And it was interesting question at the beginning, like who would the fans cheer?
Yeah.
Who do you think they cheered in this one?
I was going to say probably Henning and Bockwinkel and Lars and Blackjack because they're all American versus, well, at the time, I believe the Vachans were supposedly from Algeria and Kobayashi, Japan. And, the big K, he's from the only American.
Okay. Well, you'd be wrong.
I was going to say I'm probably wrong.
You'd be wrong. I was surprised. I went into this match because I was interested in trying to figure out which ones the fans would side with, if they did at all.
Yeah.
Because in my little mind, I'd remembered, even though it was 14, 15 years earlier, I'd remembered that the Russians and the Japanese, the fans booed them both and cheered them both when they tried to destroy each other.
Yeah.
But in this one, it was interesting because, and I want to believe that Bobby Heenan was the factor. They would not cheer Heenan. And they went and cheered the Vachans and Kobayashi and Big K.
Wow.
And so there you had it. Well, the match went to Hennig, Lars, Lanza, and Nick. And it was a wild one. It was a fun one. The thing that's fun about this card and tag team wrestling in general is that normally I'm not a fan of I guess I wasn't even really a fan of 6-man matches on a regular basis, but I liked them. But I always thought adding that 4th man to each team, like we're really stretching it here. But this was the one and only time that the Twin Cities ever got an 8-man tag. This is a one-off. So that's what made this really special.
Yeah.
And the fact that the fans were able to determine in their minds that they'd rather see the Vachans and Kobayashi and Stan win versus the others.
Yeah. That's
and
interesting.
that pretty much was one of the greatest tag teams I've ever seen.
Yeah.
The other thing I want to point out, the great thing about the psychology in tag teams, and this is why it truly is, Brian, it's a lost art today, and I wish we could bring it back.
Yeah.
It was always fun to see 2 guys that had teamed together for a number of years, and all of a sudden they'd have a falling out.
Yeah.
And that came true with Tiny Mills and Stan Kowalski. They had been together for about a 4-year run, proclaiming how great they were, proving how great they were with their titles. And then they had a falling out. Tiny, his version was, I'm tired of carrying Stan because I'm the veteran and I've been carrying this guy for years. Stan, on the other hand, saying Tiny is old and behind the times, and I'm tired of carrying him in the match. They have this battle. They wrestled each other, made for some interesting matches. But it's always interesting because as a fan, you look back and you go, oh my gosh, they don't like each other. And yes, some of us knew that wrestling wasn't real even back then, but you got to get into that suspension of disbelief. You got to believe in Santa Claus just for a little while, and it's fun. And so that was one of the angles where teams would break up.
Yeah.
Then you had scenarios like Mad Dog Vachon and Vern Gagne, who Vern Gagne is having his headaches and troubles with Stevens and Patterson, two heels. They injure his partner, Billy Robinson, and Vern can't deal with their heel tactics. And so he declares, I've decided if I want to beat these two clowns, these two roughnecks, these two bad guys, I got to have somebody who fights like them. He surprises everybody and comes up with Mad Dog Vachon. I've asked the dog to be my partner. And the dog says, no, I'm not going to be your partner. They hate each other because they have feuded. Vern and Dog have feuded for 15 years.
Yeah.
Match after match, storyline after storyline, over the title, you name it. Well, lo and behold, Vern convinces him to be his partner because Mad Dog didn't like Stevens and Patterson either. So you get that storyline where they can combine together to battle a mutual foe. And then, as Vern said, when we're done, you go your way, I'll go mine. Well, they won the title. They beat Stevens and Patterson. So now we can stay together for a year.
Yeah.
Then they go, they lose the title. They move on.
Yeah.
Well, it even gets better because when Vern had retired in 1981, I've just had a comment from a guy the other day. He says, well, Vern retired, but he didn't stay retired. So, that's bogus. Well, but again, it's about storyline and it's about drawing fans and it's about, building on this. Vern retired. Mad Dog is having trouble with Sheik Adnan El-Casey and Jerry Blackwell. And they're double teaming him and they're this and they're that. So Mad Dog, he contacts Vern Gagne, who's in retirement. And the storyline is, you owe me a favor, Vern. That's what he was telling him. I came to you when you needed me. Now you owe me a favor. Vern says, no, I am retired, Dog. I'm not wrestling. They played this out for over a month where Vern come out and he said, I've been getting telegrams. I've been getting phone calls. I've been getting letters. This guy wants me to be his partner. I am retired. Well, finally, Vern comes out and said, I've thought about it. And I agree with Mad Dog. I owe him a favor. And I was in the auditorium when he came in center ring and made this announcement, Brian.
Okay.
7,000 fans strong in the Minneapolis auditorium when Vern said, I agree with Mad Dog. I owe him a favor. I will come out of retirement for this match. You could have heard a pin. You could not have heard a pin drop in that auditorium because it was so loud.
Yeah.
The fans cheered. Now that's drawing power.
Yeah.
Now Vern was coming out and Vern made the comment. He said, I'm going to come out of retirement. I'm going to help the dog. And when we're done, and they did it on TV, they said, when I'm done, you go your way and I'll go mine. It drew. So why wouldn't you bring the guy out of retirement for one match?
Yeah.
And that was what I was getting at too, is that when you tell the correct storyline with a tag team, tag teams sometimes drew better than singles matches.
Yeah.
And we haven't even touched the iceberg here, the tip of the iceberg on how great the storylines were. But it was always about partnerships. And of course, with the Dog and Vern, the fans always asked in the initial team up, can Vern trust the Dog?
Yeah.
He's asked him to be his partner against Stevens and Patterson. Can he trust him? Because Dog was a heel.
Yeah.
So you put that element into it. What a great story.
Yeah.
And it drew fans.
Yeah.
There you have it.
Amazing. I remember that. I was a little kid. The second time around when Vern came out of retirement, I do remember that. One thing, we have these. You talk about six-man tags. You're not a fan of them and stuff, but there was a team, the Freebirds. I remember that did really well with it. Probably one of the very few that had that the ability to draw on the 6-man tags. Now they usually won tag team titles. They'd have to switch people out, which is called the Freebird rule. But what do you think of the Freebirds as a team?
I thought as a 3-man team, they were phenomenal. They were great. The better wrestlers of the team were Gordy and Roberts.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think anybody could deny that. But of the three, Hayes had the charisma, the personality, the mouth, more the draw in that department. So you put the three of them together. I'd point out with 3-man teams, this is interesting. There were times when certain territories would have a 3-man team that would work together, and 2 of the members would win a tag team title. And then the team would come out and say, well, the 3 of us are a team, so we can interchange the partners. And, these 2 can wrestle this night and these 2 the next night. And again, it was all about, well, no, you can't, because these 2 won the title. They'd play this up as controversy. So it was good.
Yeah.
The Freebirds, they're another established, to use Red Bastien's term, tag team. They wrestled in the Mid-South together. They wrestled obviously in Texas, where they were over huge with the Von Erichs.
Yeah.
That was a great feud. And they wrestled in Atlanta together. So they were an established team.
Yeah.
And they had, I think I've touched on this with you before, one of the most genius tag team moves that I've ever enjoyed was, I've always felt, and I'm honest about this, I've always felt that the Road Warriors should not have been given the AWA tag team title. And the only reason I say that is because a lot of fans today say, well, this wrestler or this team should have been given a run with the title, or that one should have had the title. And that's the mindset, because I think we can agree that titles today change so fast. There's no longevity between winning. With the Road Warriors, they should not have been given the title because they could draw money. They did not need the title to be the draw. And that's the truth. So you say, well, Billy Robinson as a singles wrestler, he didn't need the title to beat Billy Robinson.
Yeah.
He did well as a challenger.
Yeah.
And in the case of the Road Warriors, I think we all remember them. They came to the ring, to their entrance music. What was it? What was their
Iron
entrance?
Man.
Iron Man, yeah. And they came to the ring, and usually they never waited to be introduced. They came in and started tossing bodies out of the ring and dominance. And they, we talk about their no selling and that they were so dominant. And the fans got behind them and they cheered them, as well they should. For that reason, they shouldn't have been given the title, because the question that I had immediately is, how do you ever explain logically and rationally that they could lose the title? Who's going to beat them?
Yeah.
And that's my rationale.
Yeah.
To have them as challengers and getting disqualified, or having their opponents, the champions, getting disqualified, keeping the title, screwing them out of the title, having no contests where the dominance was the Road Warriors. The fans already knew they were the better team, right, in their perception, that they were the better team. So don't give them the title. So when Vern put the title on them, we know the AWA was going through some fractured moments in that year and the years going forward. The most genius thing he ever did, and this is going to take us back to the Freebirds.
Okay.
The most genius thing he ever did was, when the Warriors had given their notice they were going to leave, Vern had them drop the title to the most unassuming team, the team that no one in their right mind would have went to Vegas and put money on that they could beat the Warriors, and that was Jimmy Garvin and Steve Regal.
Yeah.
I mean, they were a good team, but they weren't champions. But here's the genius of it. In their right mind, on any given night, they could have never won the title. Fans believe that. But in order to make it real, and the only thing they could have done to defeat the Road Warriors was that particular night in St. Paul, the Freebirds had been in a battle the night before in Chicago.
Yes.
against the
Super Clash.
Warriors.
Super Clash
And
one.
so in Super Clash, correct. And so they made mention of that the Freebirds came to ringside to get revenge or to go after the Warriors. Well, during the course of the match, it ended up that it was the Freebirds, all three of them, and Regal and Garvin. And we know now the result is that because of that outside interference, the referee not seeing it,
Yeah.
the Road Warriors lost the title. But that was the only, and to me, that will forever be a very genius, creative, realistic move to do something, or let's put it this way, in my mind, to correct something that Vern shouldn't have done in the first place. Because there's no way that fans would ever believe anyone could ever beat the Road Warriors.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, once they were champions, you couldn't beat them and make it believable.
Yeah, that's an interesting. I never thought of it like that. I loved them as a kid. You know, the face paint, the coming in, kicking everybody. You know, but I was a little kid. You know, and so
hey, I liked them too for what it was worth.
Yeah,
I will be honest and tell you that I was not a fan of the way they changed tag team wrestling because they were the first team to do what they did.
Yeah,
they came in. I mean, we never, unless it was a heated program between two teams where they would just come to the ring and start battling one another,
right.
You know, over a long program between the two of them. But the Road Warriors were different in the sense that it didn't matter whether they were on TV wrestling a squash team or whether they were in the main event wrestling, you know, another main event team.
Yeah.
They just came in and they just kicked butt.
Yeah.
I mean, they just kicked butt.
Yeah.
And that was different for me as a fan. I immediately saw, okay, this is great. But once they made them champions, I said, why?
Yeah.
This doesn't make sense.
You know, looking back on it now, I'll tell you, I think honestly that a good feud that when the Long Riders wrestled the Road Warriors, that was a great feud they were having. They should have. They should have thought about, okay, we'll put the belts on the Long Riders, and then feud on for 5-6 months, whatever it was.
Yeah.
Because those guys, I've watched some matches with the Long Riders, and when you first time you see them, you're like, okay, these guys are gonna get their butts kicked by the Road Warriors because they don't look like they're in shape at all, but they're good wrestlers. But I mean, but they put on a good match.
They were a very good roughhouse team.
Yes.
And by the way, Red Bastille, they were an established tag team because they had wrestled together under masks as the Super Destroyers in Texas.
Yes.
Where the Von Erichs and Freebirds were.
Yeah.
The Long Riders. They would have been a good team. But here's the thing. We get, again, as I said, there were starting to be some cracks in the foundation, even as early as 1985, 86, because of what was happening in the wrestling business as a whole. Mm-hmm. And, Vern, I think at the time, and this isn't trying to make excuses for him,
right? He
was like every other promoter at the time. The Road Warriors had given their notice. The Freebirds were also leaving. And believe it or not, they were leaving as well at this time.
Yeah.
The Long Riders were not around as long after that. There was just no stability.
Yeah.
To try to do any long-term, can I do this and make it make sense? And as we went down the line, Mr. Electricity and Steve Regal and Jimmy Garvin, they were a great team because, and this is why they were a great tag team champions, because nobody believed they should be.
Yeah.
Everybody, you believed that no matter who their opponents were, whether it be the High Flyers or the Midnight Rockers or whoever it might have been.
Yeah.
Regal and Garvin, they're not champions. That's what made them a good team.
Yeah.
Whereas the Road Warriors, they didn't need it.
Right.
You need to have them get screwed. And now I'm going off track here.
That's all right. Go for it.
I'm gonna go to my grave with this one.
Okay.
All of those people out there who say if Vern Gagne would have put the title on Hulk Hogan, the AWA would have survived. Well, I think we can be realistic and say, no, that in hindsight, that wasn't going to be the case.
Yeah.
But here's the deal. Nick Bockwinkel was drawing so well with Heenan as the heel champion.
Yeah.
You had the gold mine right there.
Yeah.
Hogan, he was the road warriors of a single wrestler.
Yeah.
He was in the perception of every fan's mind. Nobody could beat Hulk Hogan. He was bigger than life. And by the fact that he got screwed out of the title with Heenan's interference, with disqualifications, with Hulk getting disqualified, whatever, no contest, that is what made it believable.
Yeah.
And for that reason, Vern was not going to put the title on him because and as the business was changing, we all know that it wouldn't have been a good move. So you got to look at the promotional side of it. I think the couple examples I just gave you about why somebody shouldn't be a champion.
Yeah.
And it's my opinion, folks.
Yeah.
I mean, it's fun. We can sit over a cup of coffee and talk about it. And, neither of us are right or wrong. That's what's fun about talking about wrestling. Right?
There you go. That's right. So, all right. Well, folks, I want to thank Mr. George Schire for coming on today and talking to us. George, always a pleasure. I always learn something. And,
What'd you learn today?
Well, I learned that some of these guys weren't brothers, but they look awful like the Bastille brothers. I thought they were, because they both had red hair. Who's gonna, I believed it. The Grahams, I thought they were brothers. Your analogy on the Road Warriors was made sense to me. I never thought of it like that.
I'm not saying that's right.
No. I'm saying though, I understand.
I'm just saying that was a perception that I had
as a kid. Oh yeah, they were great because they beat up these two old guys, Baron von Raschke and Crusher, to get the titles. But now, as I'm older, I understand your analogy of why maybe that shouldn't have happened, but it did. Things like that. So, I appreciate it. Again, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. George Schire, thank you, sir, for coming on. Appreciate it. Always love your insight.
Always enjoy it, Brian. Thank you. Good job as always.
Well, thank you very much. And folks, if you're watching, thank you. If you're listening, thank you. And please subscribe. Please subscribe, and we will talk to you soon.